The applause started before my father even finished the sentence. "I've waited years for this day," he said, smiling proudly from the head of the polished walnut conference table. "I'm honored to announce that my son Ethan Carter will officially become the next CEO of Carter Industrial Manufacturing." The room erupted. Directors applauded. Senior managers smiled. Family friends standing along the wall nodded with approval. Even a few reporters outside the glass doors could be seen lifting their cameras. I stayed exactly where I was. My name is Melissa Carter. I'm 39 years old and I had spent nearly 20 years helping build the company everyone was celebrating. Not one person looked at me. My father continued. "Melissa has always been dependable," he said with a pleasant smile that somehow hurt more than anger ever could. "She's been a wonderful support behind the scenes. But leadership has always been Ethan's calling." More applause. Ethan stood confidently, buttoned his expensive navy suit jacket, and shook our father's hand as if the company had already become his. "Thanks, Dad," he said. "I won't let you down." Someone laughed. Someone else congratulated him. I noticed the fresh coffee growing cold beside my folder. The room smelled of polished wood, printer paper, and expensive cologne. My humiliation had been carefully planned. But something else had been planned years before. Something nobody in that room remembered or bothered to read. My father believed he was handing my brother the company. The truth was much simpler. He couldn't. Not legally. Because the controlling voting shares no longer belonged to him. I already knew that. The documents proving it were resting quietly inside my leather briefcase beside my chair. I didn't smile. I didn't interrupt. I simply waited. Sometimes the truth doesn't need perfect timing. It only needs the agenda to reach the right page. Before I tell you how that meeting changed my family forever, I'd really appreciate it if you took a second to subscribe if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, hidden truths, and emotional justice. Every comment and every subscription helps this channel reach more people who love these kinds of stories. Now, to understand why I stayed silent while my own father handed everything to my brother, you need to understand what life inside the Carter family had always looked like. Because that meeting didn't begin our story. It only exposed it. My grandfather founded Carter Industrial Manufacturing 48 years earlier. He started with one rented warehouse, an aging pickup truck, and a belief that hard work mattered more than appearances. By the time I was born, the company employed hundreds of people across 3 states. Growing up, the business wasn't simply where my father worked. It was our family identity. Dinner conversations were about contracts. Vacations became opportunities to visit suppliers. Birthdays often ended with discussions about production schedules. Some children grew up around sports. I grew up around boardrooms. As a little girl, I adored every minute of it. Grandpa would let me organize blueprints while he explained how every employee deserved respect because every paycheck represented someone's family. He never treated me differently because I was a girl. My father did. Not immediately. At first it was subtle. When relatives asked who would someday run the company, Dad always laughed. "Well," he'd say, putting a hand on little Ethan's shoulder, "the Carter name needs a man at the top." Everyone smiled. Nobody noticed me standing only a few feet away. Or maybe they did. Maybe they simply agreed. Ethan was 4 years younger than me. He wasn't cruel. Not as a child. He simply grew up believing every room already belonged to him. Because that's exactly what everyone taught him. If Ethan earned a B in school, Dad celebrated with dinner at his favorite steakhouse. When I graduated first in my class, Dad hugged me quickly before answering a business call. Mom noticed the difference. She just explained it away. "Your brother has more pressure," she'd tell me while washing dishes. "One day he'll carry the family business." I wanted to ask why I couldn't carry it too. Instead, I dried another plate. As the years passed, I worked harder. Straight A's. Business competitions. Leadership programs. An MBA. Every achievement felt like another audition for a role nobody intended to give me. Still, I believed effort would eventually matter. After graduate school, I joined Carter Industrial full-time. Not because anyone invited me. Because I genuinely loved the company my grandfather had built. The employees became part of my life. I learned names. Families. Birthdays. Retirements. When machines failed at 2 in the morning, I answered my phone. When suppliers threatened delays, I flew across the country to negotiate. When customers considered leaving, I stayed until agreements were signed. I thought dedication would eventually speak louder than tradition. I was wrong. Tradition had a louder voice. And before long I would discover just how invisible my loyalty had always been. I wish I could tell you that the boardroom was the first time my father chose Ethan over me. It wasn't. It was simply the first time everyone else was forced to watch. For years our family had perfected a quiet system. I did the work. Ethan accepted the praise. At first I convinced myself it was temporary. He'll grow into the job, my father would say whenever Ethan struggled with something. He just needs experience. The strange part was that the experience almost always came from me. When Ethan forgot a client presentation, I stayed late rewriting the slides while he attended a networking dinner. The next morning, Dad congratulated him for handling the account beautifully. I stood in the back of the conference room holding my coffee, listening to people praise ideas I had spent 3 nights developing. I smiled anyway. It became a habit. If a supplier threatened to cancel a contract, my father called me. If the accounting department found a costly mistake, they called me. If production stopped because a machine failed or a shipment disappeared, they called me. But when the crisis ended, Dad called Ethan into his office. An hour later, Ethan walked out with another compliment, another bonus, another story about how he was preparing to become CEO. One Friday afternoon, I introduced a new inventory tracking system that cut shipping delays almost in half. The implementation took 6 exhausting months. I worked alongside warehouse managers, software consultants, and supervisors until nearly midnight, more times than I could count. At the quarterly shareholder meeting, my father pointed toward a large presentation screen. I'd like everyone to thank Ethan for modernizing our operations. The room applauded. Ethan smiled modestly. He didn't correct anyone. After the meeting, one of our warehouse supervisors quietly caught up with me near the loading docks. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "We all know who actually built that system." I nodded. "I know." He hesitated. "Why don't you ever say anything?" I looked across the parking lot where my father and Ethan were laughing together beside Dad's black SUV. Because proving someone wrong isn't always worth destroying your family. Those words felt noble then. Years later I realized they were mostly fear. The pattern continued everywhere. Holiday dinners somehow turned into strategy meetings. While everyone else enjoyed dessert, Dad slid financial reports across the dining table toward me. "Take a look at these before Monday." Mom would smile apologetically. "Melissa's always so organized." Nobody offered to help. Nobody even noticed. At Thanksgiving I carved the turkey, balanced next year's purchasing forecasts, and cleaned the kitchen while Ethan entertained relatives with stories about business trips I had actually organized. Whenever someone praised him, he accepted it naturally. Not proudly. Not maliciously. Simply because he'd spent his whole life believing he deserved it. Mom had her own favorite sentence. "Families aren't supposed to keep score." She used it whenever I quietly mentioned feeling overlooked. The strange thing was that nobody ever told Ethan not to keep score. His victories were carefully counted. Mine disappeared before they were even acknowledged. As the years passed, employees began treating me differently than my own family did. Managers asked for my advice before making important decisions. Supervisors trusted my judgment. New hires often assumed I was already running the company. Then they met my father. Everything changed. "This is my daughter, Melissa," he'd say politely. "And this is my son, Ethan, the future of Carter Industrial." I learned to recognize the uncomfortable expressions on people's faces. Most never questioned him aloud. They simply looked at me with quiet sympathy. Eventually something inside me changed. Not anger. Not resentment. Distance. I stopped chasing approval that clearly wasn't available. I focused on protecting the employees who depended on the company instead. They deserved stability even if I never received recognition. Looking back, that emotional distance became one of the smartest decisions I ever made. Because while my family was busy protecting Ethan's image, I accidentally found something they had forgotten even existed. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. The records department was preparing to digitize decades of old corporate files stored in a climate-controlled archive beneath the original headquarters building. Most executives never visited the basement. I did. Not because I enjoyed paperwork. Because Grandpa had taught me that the oldest files often explained today's problems. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as I opened faded banker boxes that hadn't been touched in years. Most contained routine financial records, expired insurance policies, old vendor agreements. Nothing unusual. Then I found a thick gray file labeled only with my grandfather's initials. Inside were estate correspondence, handwritten notes, and references to a voting trust one had never heard anyone mention. At first, I assumed the documents were outdated. Then I noticed a familiar name. Eleanor Brooks. Grandpa's longtime attorney. She was still practicing law. My heart beat a little faster. I called her office that afternoon. When she heard my name, there was a long pause. "I've wondered when someone would finally ask about those papers," she said quietly. The next morning, I drove to her office carrying copies of everything I had found. Eleanor greeted me warmly, but there was sadness in her eyes. She studied each page carefully before looking up. "Melissa," she said gently, "your grandfather trusted you more than anyone realized." For the next 2 hours, she explained something that completely changed how I understood my family's future. Years before Grandpa died, he had quietly restructured the company's voting control. He never wanted a public fight between his children and grandchildren. Instead, he created a carefully designed voting trust. Ownership and voting authority would no longer automatically belong to whoever spoke the loudest or carried the family name. The trust included strict conditions. The person receiving controlling voting rights had to complete executive education, remain with the company for at least 10 continuous years, avoid legal disputes with family members, demonstrate responsible leadership. I had unknowingly completed every requirement, without telling anyone, without competing, without demanding recognition. Eleanor slid a certified folder across her desk. "These are yours," she said. I opened it slowly. Inside were signed trust documents, board resolutions, estate certifications, and legal letters confirming that once every condition had been fulfilled, the controlling voting shares transferred automatically. To me. I stared at the pages for what felt like forever. "I don't want to fight my family," I whispered. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Your grandfather didn't want that either." "Then why didn't he tell them?" "He expected them to read the documents he paid lawyers to prepare." I let out a nervous laugh. "They never did." "No," she replied softly. "They assumed they already knew the ending." I carefully placed every document back into the folder. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting heavily on my heart. "So, what happens now?" Eleanor folded her hands. "Nothing, unless corporate governance requires disclosure." I left her office carrying papers that could change everything. But I locked them away. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell a single coworker. Part of me still hoped someone in my family would eventually discover the truth on their own. I said. Years passed. And then one afternoon my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Eleanor Brooks. I answered immediately. Her voice was calm. "The board has officially scheduled the CEO succession vote," she said. There was a brief silence. "Melissa, the trust now requires disclosure." For the first time in years, the papers hidden inside my safe were no longer just family history. They were about to become the truth no one could ignore. I didn't sleep much after Eleanor's call. The folder she had handed me years earlier sat on my dining room table beside a half-finished cup of coffee. I had opened it so many times that I could practically recite every page from memory. Certified trust agreement. Estate certification. Board resolutions. Voting authority confirmation. Everything was in order. Everything had been legal for years. Yet none of it felt like a victory. My husband, Daniel, walked into the kitchen before sunrise, still wearing his gray sweatshirt from the night before. He looked at the stack of documents and then at me. "You've been awake all night." I kept hoping I'd think of another way. He sat across from me without touching the papers. "You still don't want to hurt them." I shook my head. "They're still my family." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "Melissa, telling the truth isn't the same thing as hurting someone." "I know. But it feels like it." He smiled gently. "Your grandfather didn't spend years creating a responsible succession plan because he wanted revenge. He did it because he loved the company, and because he believed in you." His words settled over me quietly. Daniel had never encouraged me to fight my parents. In fact, whenever I came home after another exhausting family dinner or another meeting where Ethan accepted credit for my work, he never said, "You should expose them." He always asked a different question. "What kind of person do you want to be when this is over?" That question had guided me for years. I wanted to be someone who chose dignity over revenge. Someone my grandfather would recognize. Someone I could still respect when the anger finally faded. Later that morning, I drove to Eleanor Brooks' law office. She greeted me exactly as she always had, calm, prepared, and impossible to intimidate. Stacks of neatly labeled legal files covered one wall behind her desk. Framed photographs of my grandfather hung beside law degrees that stretched back nearly 40 years. Seeing his smiling face made my chest tighten. "He trusted you," I said quietly. "He trusted the truth," Eleanor corrected. She opened a fresh folder. "I've prepared updated certified copies of every document you'll need." She carefully walked me through each one. The trust agreement, the probate filings, the transfer certifications, the shareholder voting records. Every page had already been recorded years ago. Nothing was new. The only thing changing was that the board meeting legally required those records to be acknowledged before any CEO appointment could be finalized. "I still don't understand," I admitted. "Why didn't my father know?" Eleanor folded her glasses and rested them on the desk. "He knew the estate existed. He signed multiple acknowledgments after your grandfather passed away. He simply assumed the controlling shares remained under his authority. And no one questioned him." "Exactly." She slid another envelope toward me. "This contains every notice our office mailed after the estate closed." I flipped through them. Each one had been addressed correctly. Each one had delivery confirmation. Each one explained that corporate governance documents should be reviewed before any future succession decision. "They never opened these?" "They received them." She paused. "Reading them is another matter." Neither of us laughed. It wasn't funny anymore. Before I left, Eleanor looked directly at me. "When we enter that boardroom, let them tell their story first." I frowned. "You don't think I should stop my father?" "No." "Why?" "Because if you interrupt him, they'll claim you embarrassed the family." She leaned forward. "If the official corporate process reveals the truth, the documents, not you, become the reason everything changes." I nodded slowly. That difference mattered. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I wanted the company to follow its own rules. As I stood to leave, Eleanor said one last thing. "Whatever happens after tomorrow." I stopped. "Don't confuse guilt with responsibility." The word stayed with me all day. By the time I arrived at headquarters the following morning, the parking lot was already overflowing. Employees wore their best business clothes. Fresh flower arrangements decorated the lobby. A photographer adjusted lights near the executive conference room. Someone had ordered trays of pastries and silver coffee urns for the reception after the announcement. To everyone else, it looked like a celebration. To me, it felt like a farewell to the version of my family I had spent decades trying to protect. I stepped into my office and found a handwritten note waiting on my desk. "Proud of you. No matter what happens today, remember who you are. Daniel." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my blazer pocket. It felt strangely comforting. The morning passed in routine meetings. I reviewed production reports, approved supplier contracts, signed payroll authorizations. Ironically, I was doing many of the responsibilities Ethan would supposedly inherit that afternoon. Around 11 o'clock, I walked past my father's office. The door was partly open. Inside, Ethan stood in front of a mirror adjusting his tie. Dad smiled proudly. "You were born for this." "I know," Ethan replied with an easy grin. "You've prepared me my whole life." I kept walking before either of them noticed me. The sentence echoed in my head. He believed it completely. That was the tragedy. Not arrogance. Certainty. He genuinely believed the company already belonged to him. Several board members began arriving shortly before noon. Some stopped to shake my hand. "Good to see you, Melissa. We'll finally get this succession wrapped up. You must be proud of your brother." I smiled politely every time. "I hope today goes well." It wasn't a lie. I truly hoped it would. Because if everything happened according to proper corporate procedure, the company would be protected. Even if my family's pride wasn't. Near the entrance, I noticed Eleanor quietly checking in with the corporate secretary. Nobody paid much attention to her. Most people assumed she was attending out of respect for my late grandfather. Only I knew she carried the documents that would determine the future of Carter Industrial. My father welcomed guests like a man hosting his own retirement celebration. My mother wore a pearl necklace Grandpa had given her decades earlier. She looked happier than I had seen her in years. Every time someone congratulated Ethan, she beamed. Watching them was harder than I expected. For one brief moment, I wondered if I should simply leave. Walk away. Let them make the mistake. Start a different life somewhere else. But then I looked through the glass wall overlooking the manufacturing floor. Hundreds of people worked inside those buildings. Families depended on their paychecks. This wasn't only about my parents. It was about everyone whose future rested on competent leadership and lawful governance. I reached into my briefcase and touched the sealed envelope containing the trust documents. I whispered to myself, "This is for the company. Not revenge. Not pride. Responsibility." A few minutes later, the board chair entered the conference room and called everyone to their seats. The meeting was about to begin. None of them realized that before anyone could vote for a new CEO, one simple corporate procedure still had to be completed: the verification of controlling shareholder authority. And that single item on the agenda was about to change everything. The conference room fell quiet as the board chair called the meeting to order. Around the polished table sat directors who had spent decades helping shape Carter Industrial. Beside them were senior executives, our corporate secretary, outside legal counsel, and several longtime shareholders. My parents sat near the front, smiling proudly. Ethan looked completely relaxed, already acting like the office across the hall belonged to him. I took my usual seat without saying a word. The meeting opened with routine reports: quarterly revenue, safety performance, production forecasts. The numbers were strong. Ironically, many of those results reflected projects I had personally managed over the previous several years. Then my father stood. "I won't keep everyone waiting," he said with a broad smile. "Today is about the future." He looked toward Ethan. "My son has worked hard for this opportunity. He's the leader our company needs." Applause filled the room. My father thanked department heads. He thanked longtime suppliers. He thanked family friends who had supported the business for decades. He thanked Ethan for his vision. He never mentioned me. Not once. Then he smiled in my direction. "And of course," he said warmly, "we couldn't have done any of this without Melissa. She's always been dependable. Every successful company needs someone willing to support the people meant to lead." Several people laughed politely. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was the kind that comes from believing the joke is harmless. Each laugh landed harder than shouting ever could. I felt dozens of eyes turn toward me. My father continued before I could even react. "Melissa has always preferred staying behind the scenes. Leadership has never really interested her." Ethan nodded. "She's amazing at operations," he added casually. "Honestly, she's happiest when someone else handles the big-picture decisions." A few directors exchanged uncertain glances. Some of them knew better. They had worked beside me through acquisitions, supply chain crises, and contract negotiations. But this was a family matter. No one interrupted. An assistant entered carrying a velvet presentation box. My father opened it proudly. "We have one more surprise." He lifted a small crystal plaque. Its engraved words caught the overhead lights. "To Melissa Carter, for years of loyal service and unwavering support." Support. Not leadership. Not strategy. Not executive achievement. Support. "Melissa," my father said cheerfully, "come up here." The room applauded again. My legs felt strangely heavy as I walked to the front. Dad handed me the plaque with a smile photographers immediately captured. "There she is," he said. "Our dependable daughter. Our backbone. Our helper." The words were meant as compliments. They felt like chains. I looked down at the plaque. 20 years. Reduced to a thank you gift. I swallowed carefully. "Thank you," I said quietly. Nothing more. I wasn't going to argue. Not here. Not yet. As I returned to my seat, I noticed something that almost broke my composure. Near the back of the room stood Robert Hayes, our plant manager. He had worked beside my grandfather before I was even born. He didn't clap. He simply lowered his eyes. Beside him, our chief financial officer shifted uncomfortably. Several department heads looked embarrassed. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only person who understood what was happening. The board chair cleared his throat. "Congratulations," he said politely. "Before we proceed with the appointment vote, corporate governance requires completion of shareholder certification." My father waved casually. "Just a formality. It won't take long." The corporate secretary nodded. "Correct." She opened a thick binder. "As required under our bylaws, voting authority must be confirmed before executive appointments become effective." Nobody looked concerned. Not even Ethan. He leaned back comfortably in his chair. My father folded his hands with complete confidence. This was supposed to be the easiest part of the afternoon. The secretary began reading ownership records. Class A shares. Everything matched expectations. She continued. Class B shares. Still routine. Then she stopped. Her forehead tightened slightly. She reread a page. Then another. The room grew noticeably quieter. The board chair looked over. "Is there a problem?" "I'm seeing a discrepancy." My father chuckled. "Probably an old filing." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for another folder. Outside counsel leaned closer. The secretary spoke carefully. "Our records indicate that economic ownership and controlling voting authority are held separately under an active trust agreement." Silence. My father frowned. "That's impossible. I've controlled this company since my father's passing." The outside attorney adjusted his glasses. "May we review the supporting documentation?" Before anyone else could move, Eleanor Brooks calmly stood. "If it pleases the board," she said, "I have certified copies." Every head turned toward her. Until that moment, most people had barely noticed she was there. She carried a slim leather portfolio to the center of the table. Without drama. Without accusation. She opened it. Inside rested neatly organized legal documents bearing probate seals, notarized certifications, and recorded trust filings. She placed each document before the board chair. The outside attorney examined the first page. Then the second. Then the third. His expression changed completely. He passed the papers to another attorney. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one of them looked toward my father. "These documents appear valid. They've been part of the estate record since your father's probate." Dad blinked. "No. There has to be some mistake." "There isn't," Eleanor replied gently. "The voting trust became effective years ago." Ethan leaned forward. "What voting trust?" "The one established by your grandfather." My father's voice hardened. "I never approved anything like this." Eleanor met his eyes calmly. "You signed acknowledgement of the estate administration." "Multiple times." "I signed probate paperwork." "You signed receipt of notices explaining the trust." "I never saw this." "The notices were delivered." The room remained perfectly still. The board chair turned toward me for the first time that afternoon. "Miss Carter." His voice was respectful now. "Would you please clarify your role under this trust?" I slowly opened my briefcase. My hands were steady. Inside lay the envelope I had carried for years. I removed one final document. Trustee certification. The original seal reflected the conference room lights. I placed it quietly on the table. "This confirms," I said calmly, "that after fulfilling every condition established by my grandfather, I became the controlling voting shareholder." No one spoke. Not immediately. The silence felt enormous. The attorney reviewed the certification carefully before nodding. "This appears to be fully enforceable." He looked around the room. "Under the company's bylaws, the appointment of a chief executive officer cannot proceed without Ms. Carter's approval." The color drained from Ethan's face. My mother stared at me as if she were seeing a stranger. My father looked from the documents to me, then back again. "This." He struggled to finish the sentence. "This can't be happening." I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Years of being ignored had led to this single moment. Not because I had planned revenge. Because no one had bothered to read the truth already sitting in front of them. The board chair folded his hands. "Miss Carter." Every eye in the room settled on me. "The board will need your decision before we move forward." I looked at the faces around the table. Some were confused. Some were sympathetic. Some simply waited. For years my family had spoken for me. Now, the room was finally waiting to hear my own voice. No one spoke. The silence stretched so long that I could hear the quiet hum of the air conditioning above the conference room ceiling. The board chair looked at me patiently. "Ms. Carter," he repeated, "the board cannot continue until we know whether you approve the proposed appointment." I slowly stood. For years I had imagined what I would say if I were ever given the chance to speak honestly. Now that the moment had arrived, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply finished pretending. I rested both hands lightly on the conference table. I never wanted this meeting to become a family dispute. My voice was calm, steady. I came here because this company deserves to follow its own rules. No one interrupted. I turned toward my father. "Dad, I never tried to take anything away from you." His face remained pale. "You should have told me." "I tried." He frowned. "When?" "I asked several times over the years that we review Grandpa's estate planning before discussing succession. You always said there wasn't anything left to review." Several directors quietly exchanged looks. I continued. "I accepted your answer because I trusted you." Then I looked toward Ethan. "I never competed with you. I never asked employees to compare us. I never asked anyone to choose sides." He swallowed hard. "Then why keep this secret?" "I didn't." The room remained silent. The trust required confidentiality until corporate governance required disclosure. Eleanor gently slid several dated letters toward the board. Our office repeatedly notified the family that the trust documentation should be reviewed before any executive succession. The board chair examined the dates. "So these notices were sent years ago?" "Yes." "By certified mail?" The outside attorney nodded. "I've confirmed the delivery records." My father rubbed his forehead. "I don't remember these." Eleanor answered softly. "Not remembering doesn't change the legal effect." No one smiled. No one celebrated. This wasn't a courtroom victory. It was a painful realization. One director finally spoke. "I've served on this board for 18 years. He looked directly at me. "I'd like to ask a question." I nodded. "If you already held this authority, why didn't you remove your father?" The answer came easily. "Because I respected what he built. I disagreed with many decisions. But he devoted his life to this company. I never wanted to erase that." Several executives slowly nodded. The chief financial officer spoke next. "I'd also like the record to reflect that many of our recent operational improvements were led by Melissa." He looked around the room. "The inventory modernization. The supplier restructuring. The compliance overhaul. The expansion into 2 new facilities. Those projects were hers." Robert Hayes cleared his throat from the back of the room. "I've worked here 34 years. He wasn't even a board member. Yet everyone listened. I worked beside Richard Carter." He meant my grandfather. "And I worked beside Melissa." He looked toward Ethan. "With respect, son. I've never seen you lead this company the way she already has." Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time since the meeting began, his confidence disappeared. "I didn't ask for people to lie," he said quietly. "No," I answered. "You didn't. You just stopped questioning why every success somehow became yours." His shoulders dropped. "I guess I did." My father suddenly stood. "This is still my company." The outside attorney spoke carefully. "Mr. Carter, it remains your company financially. But voting control follows the trust. The bylaws leave very little room for interpretation." Dad looked around the room searching for support. Instead he found thoughtful faces. Concern. Disappointment. No outrage. Only facts. The board chair turned back to me. "The proposed resolution appointing Ethan Carter as CEO is currently before the board. Do you approve?" I looked at Ethan. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked frightened. Not because he had lost power. Because, perhaps for the first time in his life, someone expected him to earn it. I answered slowly. "No." No shouting. No dramatic pause. Just one word. The room remained perfectly still. Then I continued. "My decision is not a rejection of my brother. It's a rejection of entitlement." I took a slow breath. "I will support any candidate, including Ethan, who completes an independent executive evaluation, demonstrates operational readiness, and earns the board's confidence through measurable performance. I looked around the table. No member of my family should receive leadership simply because of our last name. Our employees deserve better than that. Our customers deserve better. So does Grandpa's legacy. The board chair nodded thoughtfully. Would you be willing to submit a formal governance proposal? Yes. I already have. I handed him another folder. Inside was a succession framework I had quietly prepared months earlier. It required independent evaluations, executive mentoring, performance benchmarks, annual board review. Exactly the kind of structure my grandfather would have wanted. The directors spent several minutes reading through it. One after another they nodded. Finally the chair called for a vote. The proposal before us is to suspend the current CEO appointment and adopt Ms. Carter's governance recommendations. Hands began rising. 3, 6, 9. The resolution passed overwhelmingly. There was no cheering. Only relief. The meeting officially adjourned. As people slowly stood, several employees quietly approached me. Robert shook my hand first. Your grandfather would be proud. The chief financial officer smiled. I've wanted this conversation to happen for years. One director paused beside me. You showed remarkable restraint. I smiled faintly. I had good teachers. Across the room my father remained seated. He looked smaller somehow. Not weak. Just human. The certainty that had guided him for decades had disappeared in a single afternoon. Ethan finally walked toward me. I owe you an apology. I looked at him. You don't owe me words. You owe yourself honesty. He nodded slowly. I don't know if I'm ready. I know. But now you have the chance. He quietly left the room. I watched him go, wondering whether this painful day might eventually become the beginning of his own growth. Outside the conference room, reporters had already begun asking questions. The company released only a brief statement. The board had postponed the CEO appointment pending governance review. No family details were discussed publicly. That decision protected everyone involved. Over the following weeks, the consequences unfolded naturally. Employees seemed lighter. Rumors disappeared because the facts were finally clear. Shareholders praised the board for following proper corporate governance instead of family expectations. Several industry publications described the transition as an example of responsible succession planning. The company's reputation remained strong. If anything, investor confidence improved. Inside the business, I reorganized executive responsibilities with the board's approval. Major decisions now required greater transparency. Independent oversight committees were created. Promotion standards became written instead of assumed. Nobody, not even me, would ever receive authority without accountability again. Ethan wasn't fired. I refused to let this become personal punishment. Instead, he was offered executive coaching, leadership development, and operational training. Whether he accepted that opportunity would be his decision. My father remained on the board. His experience still mattered. But for the first time in decades, it existed alongside accountability rather than unquestioned authority. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the meeting, my assistant knocked softly on my office door. Melissa. Your parents are here. They're asking if you'll meet with them. I stared out the window overlooking the factory floor. For years, I had waited for my family to want an honest conversation. Now, it seemed that conversation could no longer be avoided. I let them wait for almost 10 minutes. Not to punish them. To give myself enough time to walk into that conversation without carrying the anger I had held for so many years. When I finally entered the small conference room, my father was standing beside the window with his hands in his pockets. My mother sat quietly at the table, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. Ethan stood near the coffee station looking more uncomfortable than I had ever seen him. No one spoke at first. The silence felt strangely familiar. Only this time it wasn't filled with assumptions. It was filled with consequences. My father was the first to break it. I never thought it would end like this. I pulled out a chair and sat down. It hasn't ended. He looked at me. It feels like it has. For a long moment, neither of us said another word. Finally he sighed. I honestly believed I was doing what my father wanted. I shook my head gently. No. You believed you already knew what Grandpa wanted. Those aren't the same thing. He lowered his eyes. I suppose they aren't. Mom reached across the table. We all made mistakes. I didn't take her hand. She looked surprised. Melissa. I spent 20 years trying to earn a place that should never have required permission. You asked me to stay quiet. You asked me to be patient. You asked me to understand. I paused. Did anyone ever ask Ethan to understand me? The room became very still. Mom slowly withdrew her hand. Tears formed in her eyes. I thought I was keeping the family together. You were keeping the peace, I answered softly. There's a difference. Ethan finally stepped forward. I need to say something. We all looked at him. I accepted things I didn't earn. His voice shook. I kept telling myself Dad knew best. I never asked why everyone congratulated me for projects I barely touched. He swallowed. I should have. I nodded. Yes. You should have. He looked directly at me. I'm sorry. The words sounded genuine. Not polished. Not rehearsed. Just painfully honest. For the first time in years I believed him. Dad sat down slowly. I owe you an apology too. I spent so much time preparing Ethan for leadership that I never realized you were already leading. Those words would have meant everything to me 10 years earlier. Now, they simply felt late. I appreciate you saying that. He looked hopeful. Can we fix this? I thought carefully before answering. I don't know. His face fell. I love all of you. I probably always will. But love isn't enough. Trust has to be rebuilt. And that takes time. Mom wiped away a tear. So, what happens now? I smiled sadly. Business stays in the boardroom. Family stays outside it. No more private pressure. No more decisions based on guilt. If we have a relationship, it has to be an honest one. Dad nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not sure you do. He looked confused. For years I believed my value depended on whether you approved of me. It doesn't anymore. I won't go back to living that way. No one argued. Because there wasn't anything left to argue about. A week later Mom invited me to Sunday dinner. The message was warm. Almost hopeful. I read it twice before replying. Not yet. I hope someday. But I need more time. She responded with only 3 words. I understand now. I hoped she meant them. Months passed. Life became surprisingly quiet. The company settled into a healthier rhythm. Board meetings focused on strategy instead of family expectations. Independent leadership reviews became standard practice. Employees started speaking more openly because they knew ideas mattered more than last names. Several younger managers, especially women, began asking me for career advice. One afternoon, a new supervisor named Lauren stopped by my office. I've always worried that I'll have to work twice as hard just to be noticed. I smiled. I won't promise the world is fair. But I will promise that your preparation matters. Learn everything. Document everything. And never confuse silence with weakness. She thanked me before leaving. As the door closed, I realized I had just repeated the lesson my grandfather spent years teaching me. His legacy had survived. Not because of money. Because of character. Daniel noticed the change in me long before I did. One evening we were sitting on our back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. He handed me a cup of coffee. You laugh more now. I smiled. I didn't even realize I'd stopped. You carried that company home every night. And now you leave work at work. He was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't constantly trying to prove that I deserved a place in my own family. I already knew where I belonged. The board later approved an idea that meant more to me than any executive title ever could. We established the Richard Carter Leadership Scholarship. Every year, daughters of Carter industrial employees who wanted to study business, engineering, finance, or manufacturing leadership could apply. The first scholarship ceremony was held inside the same headquarters where I had once been publicly overlooked. Watching young women walk across the stage with confidence in their eyes felt like healing a wound that had existed long before I was born. Some family relationships improved slowly. Dad asked more questions than he gave answers. Mom stopped asking me to keep the peace. Ethan completed executive training and gradually earned genuine respect from employees. Not because he was my brother. Because he finally started doing the work. We were never as close as people imagine siblings should be. But we became honest. Oddly enough, that was better. Sometimes healing doesn't look like returning to what existed before. Sometimes healing means building something completely different. Looking back, people often assume the greatest inheritance I received was controlling voting shares. They're wrong. The greatest inheritance my grandfather left me was the courage to trust the truth, even when it stood alone. He understood something I spent years learning for myself. Real leadership isn't about being chosen. It's about becoming the kind of person who deserves responsibility whether anyone is watching or not. My father thought he was giving the company to the son he believed would protect it. Instead, he discovered that my grandfather had already trusted the daughter who quietly had. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or made to believe your worth depended on someone else's approval, I hope my story reminds you of something important. You don't have to shout to be seen. You don't have to beg to belong. And you never have to shrink yourself just to make someone else comfortable. Sometimes the strongest answer isn't revenge. It's preparation. It's integrity. It's quietly holding on to the truth until the right moment arrives. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family or at work? And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who might need the reminder that dignity is never something another person gets to give or take away.